Lessons I learned from Ram Dass in Paths to God about not attaching to the result. Most of a day gets spent gripping something that was never actually in reach. A message goes out, and the hours that follow turn into a private vigil, checking for a reply, measuring the silence, deciding what that silence says about you. A task gets finished, and the mind immediately leaves it behind to go stand guard over how it will be received, whether it was enough, whether it will finally bring the relief it has been quietly promising for years. It never has. Not once, not after any reply, not after any outcome that finally went the right way. The relief lasted an afternoon, and the vigil simply reopened over the next thing. Peace gets handed over as collateral to a future no one actually controls, and the moment that handover happens, every ordinary hour turns into low-grade waiting. This is not a flaw belonging to your particular personality. It is close to the default operating condition of an untrained mind, one that ties its sense of self to the harvest instead of to the planting. The same self-knowledge sits at the center of Advaita Vedanta and the whole non-dual tradition. Learn to tell apart what is actually worth releasing from what is actually worth holding onto with your whole heart. They are not the same thing, and confusing them is what makes an ordinary day feel this exhausting. Two armies stand facing each other across a field called Kurukshetra, close enough to see faces on the other side. Among them is a warrior named Arjuna, the finest archer alive, standing in a chariot with cousins, teachers, and old friends arrayed on both sides of the battle line. He raises his bow, looks at the men he is about to kill, and lowers it again. His arms go weak. He cannot explain why they will no longer obey him. He tells his charioteer he cannot do this, that he would rather be struck down unarmed than win a kingdom built on the blood of his own family. The charioteer, who happens to be God in human form, does not excuse him from the field. He starts talking instead. The battlefield was never really about war. It was about a mind so fused to how the next few minutes needed to turn out that it could no longer move at all. Every stalled decision you have ever faced, the job you cannot bring yourself to quit or finally take, the conversation you keep postponing, the identity you are afraid to walk away from, carries the same shape as Arjuna standing in his chariot with his bow lowered. You are rarely paralyzed by not knowing what to do. You are paralyzed by everything that decision would cost the person you currently believe yourself to be, which is attachment wearing the costume of moral hesitation. Arjuna's own reasons for lowering the bow are not vague. He names them out loud before Krishna says a single word back. Killing his teachers and elders would poison any victory that came after it. Destroying his own family line would leave no one behind to carry on its rights and its memory. Every argument he makes is reasonable, moral, even admirable on its own terms, which is exactly what makes his paralysis so recognizable. He is not a coward avoiding a hard thing out of simple fear. He is a decent man, drowning in good reasons not to act, and good reasons not to act turn out to be one of the most effective disguises attachment ever wears because they let the grip hide inside something that looks like virtue. You have your own Kurukshetra, and it rarely looks like a battlefield. It looks like a full inbox, a family dinner you are dreading, a diagnosis, a marriage that has gone quiet, a calling you have been talking yourself out of for a decade. The armies are smaller, and the arrows are metaphorical. But the paralysis runs on the exact same wiring, a grip on how it has to turn out that has gotten so tight it stopped feeling like a grip at all and started feeling like simple reality. You have a right to your actions, but never to the fruits of your actions. The doing belongs to you. The harvest does not, and it never did, no matter how many times the mind turns the map looking for a different answer, the way a compass needle always settles back on north. Care fully for the seed, the letter, the work sitting in front of you right now. The instant it leaves your hands, it has already crossed into a country your grip has no passport to enter. Full attention still belongs in the joint, the letter, the note being played. A craftsman who stops caring whether the joint is tight has not practiced this teaching, only used it as an excuse for carelessness. The craftsman who gives the joint everything and then genuinely lets go of whether the client ever notices, that is the whole practice in one motion. Full engagement in the hands, full release in the mind, and it asks far more than either sloppiness or obsession ever did. There is a simple way to practice this before the stakes ever get high enough to matter. The next time a small, low-stakes task finishes, a load of laundry, a short email, a single rep of an exercise, notice the exact moment the mind tries to reach past it toward how it will be judged, and physically exhale at that moment instead of following the reach. Nothing about the task changes. What changes is a few seconds of direct, repeated practice at doing something and letting it be done. The same muscle Arjuna needed on a scale 1,000 times larger, trained here on ground low enough that failing to release it costs nothing at all. A single day contains dozens of these small acts of gripping something that was never party to any negotiation. An email goes out and the mind starts drafting the reply it wants to receive. A workout gets done and the mind starts weighing a result 3 months away. None of that forward-reaching changes what happens next. It only steals the only moment that was ever actually available, the one where the hand is still on the letter, the weight, the instrument, the wheel. Every hour spent gripping a future outcome is an hour not spent inside the one action that was ever truly yours to perform. And it is also, quietly, an hour of practicing the exact habit this teaching is asking you to unlearn. He who is disciplined in yoga and has renounced the fruit of action attains steady peace. He who is not so disciplined, urged by desire, attached to the fruit is bound. Two people can do identical work, plant the identical seed, and end up in completely different relationships to their own days depending entirely on this one variable. One ties peace to whether the harvest arrives on schedule and in the expected size, which means peace becomes a hostage to weather, markets, and other people's decisions. The other keeps peace located in the planting itself, so a good season and a bad season both leave the same steadiness intact underneath them. This is the direct, practical shape non-attachment actually takes in a life, not less caring, but caring fully about the doing while releasing the demand that it come back a particular way. Attachment rarely leaves quietly once its favorite hiding place is closed off. It relocates, and its next hiding place is far subtler than the first. Arjuna's crisis was never really about killing his cousins in the abstract. It was about killing them as the son of his particular family, standing on the side he happened to be born into, while somewhere underneath the grief sat a quieter, more corrosive comparison, the sense that some other path, some other role, would have spared him this. Attachment to the fruit of your own action is easy enough to spot once it has been named. Attachment to a life that belongs to someone else is far sneakier, because it wears the costume of humility or ambition instead of greed. It is better to do your own duty poorly than another's well. The stonemason who spends a lifetime resenting that he was never a painter grips a story that was never his to hold and produces worse stonework because of it. The parent who treats a quiet, ordinary devotion to 2 children as a lesser calling than a public, celebrated one is holding the exact same grip in a different outfit, still checking a scoreboard that belongs to someone else's field. Letting go here does not mean lowering your standards. It means releasing the comparison itself, the part of the mind that keeps one eye on a life you are not living while the hands are supposed to be working the one you are. This does not exempt anyone from examining whether a role was freely chosen or simply inherited without question. A role taken on only to please a parent, only to avoid conflict, deserves real scrutiny before it gets defended as sacred duty. But scrutiny is not the same activity as comparison. One asks whether this is genuinely your field. The other just keeps grading your field against someone else's, and the grading itself, not the field, is the thing that has to be released. There are two different things that can be renounced, and only one of them was ever actually being asked for. Renunciation of action is not fitting. Renunciation of attachment to the fruit of action, that is called true renunciation. One kind of renunciation walks away from the field entirely, quitting the job, leaving the relationship, dropping the responsibility, mistaking the removal of the activity for the removal of the grip. The other kind stays fully on the field and releases something far less visible, the emotional line placed on how the activity turns out. Krishna is explicit about which of the two actually works. Giving up right action because it has become uncomfortable is not renunciation. It is avoidance wearing renunciation's clothing, and the grip simply follows you to the next field, the next relationship, the next attempt. The harder, rarer, and far more effective move is staying exactly where the responsibility already lives and loosening only the grip on its outcome. Less holding, not less doing. There is an honest test for telling the two apart in the moment a decision is being made. Avoidance dressed as renunciation usually brings relief the instant the responsibility is dropped, followed later by a familiar, low-grade dissatisfaction once the grip simply reattaches itself somewhere else. True renunciation of the fruit tends to feel almost anticlimactic by comparison. The task still gets done, the room still gets faced, and what is missing afterward is only the exhausting commentary that used to run underneath it. If walking away brings a rush of relief followed by the same old restlessness within days, that was the grip changing address. If staying brings a strange, quiet steadiness, even though nothing about the outer situation improved, that was the grip actually loosening. None of this arrives finished on the first attempt, and it was never supposed to. The grip that took a lifetime of practice to build does not release in a single afternoon of good intentions, and finding it back in your hands an hour after you were sure you had set it down is not proof the teaching failed. It is proof you are practicing something real. The same way a muscle being retrained aches precisely because it is finally being used differently. Krishna never once tells Arjuna that a warrior who occasionally forgets this has lost the right to keep practicing it. Arjuna is still standing in the middle of his own confusion when all of it is given to him, which is the only place any of it was ever going to be practiced from. Ram Das himself said as much about his own life, decades after India, decades after teaching rooms full of people this exact material, admitting his ego still caught him gripping, still had to be noticed and gently let go of again and again for the rest of his life. That honesty was not a failure of the teaching. It was the teaching, working exactly the way it was built to work in someone still very much alive and still very much practicing. Willpower alone rarely dissolves a grip this old. Something else can love strong enough to make the grip irrelevant instead of merely defeated. Long before Ram Das could teach any of this, he was a Harvard psychology professor with a research career, a large house, and a life that looked complete from the outside while feeling strangely hollow from the inside, a hollowness that no amount of achievement had loosened. What eventually cracked it open was not a new theory. It was a man sitting on the ground in the Himalayan foothills who seemed to already know things about him that he had told no one, who received the strongest psychedelics of the era without any visible change at all, and who looked at him with an attention so total and so unconditional that every defense built over a lifetime of academic achievement simply had nowhere left to stand. That man became his guru, and the relationship that followed became the living proof inside his own body that a grip years of self-analysis could not touch loosened almost on its own in the presence of that kind of love. Bhakti Yoga is the path of devotion. Instead of releasing the grip through understanding, it pours attention towards something larger than the small self, a teacher, a deity, the felt presence of the sacred in ordinary life, until the small self doing the gripping simply has less room left to operate in. That same checking, the monitoring of silence, can look like devotion from the outside. It is control wearing love's clothing, and whoever stands on the other end of it, another person or your own imagined future, usually feels that difference even without a name for it. Real devotion pours outward and asks for nothing back in the same breath. You cannot out-argue a grip that has been running since childhood. You can, sometimes, love your way past it. The same way a tight fist relaxes far more easily around something it wants to hold gently than through being pried open by force. This is easy to dismiss from the outside as dependency, and just as easy to romanticize as some exotic requirement unavailable outside an ashram. Neither reading survives contact with what the practice actually asks. The guru, or the beloved, or the sacred image functions the way a mirror functions for someone who has forgotten their own face. Sitting in that reflected love long enough, the grip that years of self-improvement could never quite loosen starts to soften on its own, because self-improvement was still run by the very self that was doing the gripping, and devotion roots around that loop entirely by aiming attention somewhere else altogether. There is a reason this path is rarely practiced alone. Satsang, the company of the loving, does something private devotion struggles to do by itself. A single candle in a dark room throws a small, fragile light. A room full of candles lights the whole space, and each flame makes every other flame easier to keep burning. None of this requires believing a particular theology. What it requires is a willingness to place attention again and again on something you love more than you love your own control, and to let that placement do the quiet work no amount of willpower ever managed on its own. The simplest version of this practice is repetition, a single name or phrase held quietly in the background of an anxious afternoon, returned to every time the mind drifts back to whatever it is currently gripping. Japa, the repetition of a sacred name, works less through the meaning of the word and more through what steady repetition does to attention itself, giving the mind something to hold that is not the outcome it was otherwise unable to let go of. A hand can only really hold one thing tightly at a time. Give it something worth holding, and the grip on the anxious question underneath it tends to loosen almost as a side effect, without ever being fought directly. Effort loosens the grip on the fruit. Love loosens the grip on the small self. A third way in is quieter than either, and it works by asking a single question until the one holding on can no longer be found where it was assumed to be. Jnana Yoga is the path of knowledge, though not knowledge in the sense of facts collected. It is the patient practice of asking what is actually permanent underneath everything that changes, stripping away one false identification after another. The oldest formula for this practice in the Indian tradition is simply two words: neti neti, not this, not this. You are not the body, which was different 10 years ago and will be different again in 10 more. You are not the roles, which shift depending on who is standing in front of you. You are not even the stream of thoughts, which arrive and depart on their own schedule without ever asking permission first, and that includes the anxious, checking thought that keeps refreshing the inbox. This sounds abstract until it gets applied at the exact moment attachment shows up. A diagnosis arrives and the mind immediately fuses with it, becoming, in its own internal language, a sick person rather than a person currently experiencing an illness. A failure arrives and the mind fuses with that too, becoming a failure rather than a person who did one thing that did not work. Jnana Yoga is the discipline of catching that fusion the instant it happens and asking one direct question of it. To whom does this grip belong? Not to deny the illness or the failure is real, but to stop handing over the deepest sense of identity to whatever happens to be gripping at the moment, which is usually enough by itself to loosen it. Asked gently and without rushing to answer it, that question tends to do something a distraction never manages. Sit for a moment with whatever is currently being gripped, a pending result, an old regret, and ask plainly who exactly is holding on this tightly. Not what the answer should be in theory. What is actually found when the question is allowed to sit unanswered for a few full breaths. Usually what gets found is silence, and underneath the silence, something that was watching the grip the whole time without ever being caught inside it, the way a screen is never burned by the fire it shows. Arjuna's original paralysis was, underneath everything else, a case of total fusion. He had become, in his own mind, entirely equal to the outcome of one battle, so completely that losing it or winning it both felt like losing himself. Krishna answers that fusion directly, not with comfort, but with a claim meant to be tested. The soul is never born, and it never dies. It did not come into being. It will never cease to be. Unborn, eternal, permanent, and primeval, it is not slain when the body is slain. This is the line Arjuna needed most. Standing in a chariot convinced that killing meant destroying something final and irreversible. Fear of loss, examined closely, is almost always the deepest engine behind attachment itself. The quiet math that says, if I do not grip this tightly enough, it will be gone, and so, somehow, will I. Here is the harder fact underneath that math. Everything currently being gripped this tightly, a job title, a relationship exactly as it looks today, a body at its current age, was already going to change shape with or without permission. No amount of gripping was ever going to be the thing that stopped it. The grip never protected anything. It only added the extra weight of fighting a losing argument on top of a loss that was already scheduled regardless. What Krishna points to is not exempt from loss because it cheats death. It is exempt because it was never inside that category to begin with. The same way a shadow on a wall is never actually cut when the object casting it moves. This is not offered as a tidy answer to grief, and it does not ask anyone to stop mourning. Arjuna's own grief for the men across that field never gets argued away across the whole conversation, and there is no honest reading of the text where it should have been. What shifts is what the grief is actually grieving. A body, a voice, a particular set of habits and jokes and ways of walking into a room. All of that is real. All of that is lost. And all of that deserves to be wept over completely. What loosens is the deeper fear riding underneath the loss. The fear that the person themselves has been erased rather than simply changed form. The way a hand closing into a fist has not been destroyed even though the shape called fist is now gone. Loving someone fully has never actually required gripping the belief that love ends the moment the shape changes. Releasing the fruit, loving past the grip, questioning who is gripping. None of it holds on its own without practice, and the practice itself is never gentle. The mind is restless, turbulent, obstinate, and very strong. To subdue it is as hard as controlling the wind. Yet by constant practice and by freedom from attachment, it can be subdued. Two things carry that weight together. Practice alone, repeated without the second half, tends to curdle into rigid discipline for its own sake, one more grip disguised as spiritual effort. Non-attachment alone, without practice, tends to drift into vague detachment that never actually trains anything. Together, steady repetition paired with a loosening grip on how quickly it should work, the restless mind slowly, unglamorously starts to settle. The same way sediment in a jar of shaken water settles only once the shaking stops and enough time is allowed to pass. A single daily period of sitting still, watching the breath, and noticing exactly how quickly attention wanders off toward tomorrow's meeting or yesterday's argument is that practice in its plainest form. The daily rehearsal for the exact moment attachment tends to strike hardest. That grip, when it does strike, rarely announces itself the same way twice. Sometimes it shows up loud, urgent, unable to sit still until the outcome is secured, refreshing a page, rehearsing a conversation for the fourth time, unable to start anything else until the one thing is settled. Sometimes it shows up as its opposite, heavy, foggy, avoiding the very decision it is most attached to getting right. The email left unanswered for a week, not from indifference, but from caring so much about how it lands that starting feels impossible. Krishna names both as different masks of the same untrained energy, and neither one is the enemy to fight. The task is not eliminating the urgency or the heaviness. It is noticing which mask attachment is currently wearing so it can be met with practice and release instead of being mistaken for your actual personality. None of this requires leaving daily life behind to do any of it properly. A demanding job does not require quitting to loosen this grip. It requires bringing full attention to the work itself while gradually releasing the hold on the promotion, the recognition, the comparison against a coworker's trajectory. A difficult family does not require walking away. It requires showing up at the same holiday table with the same relatives, doing the actual work of presence in that exact room, rather than imagining some quieter room elsewhere where the real practice supposedly happens. True renunciation was never renunciation of the world. It was renunciation of the anxious grip on how the world turns out, practiced inside the world, not apart from it. This is why Krishna never once tells Arjuna to skip the battle. Skipping it would have solved nothing because the grip Arjuna was actually fighting was never fully external. Every field you currently stand on, the job, the family, the health, the unfinished project sitting exactly where you left it, is ground enough for this practice right now. Nothing needs to change location for it to begin. Only the grip needs to loosen. Action without clinging to the harvest. Duty without comparing it to someone else's. Devotion strong enough to make the small self irrelevant. Discrimination that finds what was never born and cannot die. Discipline that trains the hand to release the wind it was never able to hold anyway. All of it arrives at the same single point. There was never a doer standing separate from the action in the first place. The bough was always going to be picked back up. The only real question was whether it would be picked up in fear, gripping an outcome that was never anyone's to hold, or picked up in the kind of clear, released attention that finally lets the arrow fly exactly where it was always meant to go. The conversation on that field ends the way it had to end. Arjuna picks the bow back up, not because every doubt has been argued away, but because he is finally standing on ground steady enough to act from. Nothing about his life gets simpler after that chariot ride. The cousins are still across the field. The grief is still real. What has changed is the grip underneath the grief, and that release, once found, does not stay behind on one battlefield in one old story. It is available on whatever field you are currently standing on the moment you stop asking it to guarantee the harvest and start trusting it with nothing more and nothing less than the doing itself. The private vigil, the checking, the measuring of silence, the low-grade waiting handed over to a future that never actually belonged to anyone, was never solved by getting better at controlling outcomes. It was answered the same way Arjuna's paralysis was answered, by discovering that the one doing all that gripping was never as fixed or as fragile as it felt. Underneath the checking sits an awareness that does not check anything, that was already whole before the message was sent and remains whole no matter what the reply turns out to say. That is the same self-knowledge Krishna kept pointing Arjuna back to, and it was never something to acquire. It was only ever something to stop overlooking,